Something felt different that afternoon. Barron couldn't place it at first, but there was a weight in the air, subtle yet undeniable. It wasn't the empty hallways or the fading footsteps of students heading home. It was something else. Something he hadn't noticed before. And then, he saw him. Mr. Lawson, the school janitor, moving his broom in slow, practiced strokes across the floor. It was a sight Barron had seen 1,000 times but never really looked at. Today, though, something made him pause. The man was old, too old to still be working like this. His shoulders slumped slightly, his steps steady but heavy, like each one carried years of unseen struggle. His uniform, neatly pressed but worn at the edges, hinted at decades spent in these very hallways. Barron's eyes lingered on him, a thought creeping into his mind. Why is he still here? That question, so small, so simple, was about to change everything. Barron leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. His neck ached from looking down at his work for too long. His eyes drifted to the hallway again, where Mr. Lawson moved the broom back and forth in slow, steady strokes. For a moment, Barron just watched. The man had a quiet rhythm, one that spoke of years spent doing the same thing over and over. His hands, rough and veined, gripped the wooden handle with ease, as if the broom were an extension of himself. Something about it didn't sit right. Barron stood, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the floor. He walked to the doorway, hesitating for half a second before stepping out. "Afternoon, Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice carrying through the still hallway. The old man looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face before he gave a small nod. "Afternoon, Barron." Barron glanced at the broom, then back at him. "You always here this late?" Mr. Lawson shrugged, sweeping another dust pile into the pan. "Got to finish up before heading home." Barron leaned against the doorframe. "Long day." A tired chuckle escaped the janitor's lips. "They all are." For a few seconds, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft rustling of the broom against the floor. Barron shifted his weight, glancing at the empty hallway stretching beyond them. He didn't know why, but something about the moment made him uneasy. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could think twice. Mr. Lawson stopped. His grip on the broom tightened just slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "A little over 40 years now." His voice was even, but there was something beneath it. Something Barron couldn't quite place. Barron blinked. 40 years? That was longer than most people even stayed in one career. "You've been here that long?" Mr. Lawson gave a slow nod. "Started when I was in my 30s. Never left." Barron tried to picture it. The same halls, the same rooms, the same broom in his hands every day for 4 decades. It felt impossible. "Why?" he asked, his voice softer this time. The janitor exhaled, leaning slightly on the broomstick. "Because sometimes, life doesn't give you many choices. It just gives you a way to keep going." Barron didn't know what to say to that. The weight of those words settled over him, pressing against something he didn't even realize was there. And for the first time, he looked at Mr. Lawson not just as the janitor, but as a man with a story. Barron shifted his stance, crossing his arms as he watched Mr. Lawson carefully. The man didn't seem bitter about his words, but there was something about the way he said them, like he had accepted a truth Barron had never even considered. "You ever thought about retiring?" Barron asked, keeping his voice light. Mr. Lawson let out a quiet breath, his fingers tightening around the broom handle. "Thought about it plenty," he admitted. "But thinking about something and having the choice to do it, those are 2 different things." Barron frowned. "What do you mean?" The janitor nodded slowly, as if deciding where to begin. "My wife got sick a few years back," he said. "Doctors, hospitals, medicine, it all adds up fast. Before you know it, the bills stack higher than you can reach. Insurance only covers so much. The rest." He gave a small shrug. "That's on you." Barron stayed silent. He had never worried about medical bills before. Never had to think about how fast life could flip on someone. "She doing better now?" he asked hesitantly. Mr. Lawson's lips pressed into a thin line. She passed last year. Barron's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected that. I'm sorry, he said, unsure if the words meant anything at all. Mr. Lawson just nodded. She fought hard. I did what I could, but life doesn't pause when you're hurting. You still got to pay rent, put food on the table. And my kids? They got families of their own to take care of. I couldn't be another burden on them. Barron felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. He had never thought about life like that, about a person having to keep working, not because they wanted to, but because stopping wasn't an option. You don't have savings or anything? He asked carefully. A soft chuckle escaped Mr. Lawson's lips. Savings? He repeated, shaking his head. You spend your whole life making just enough to get by, and there's not much left to put away. Any little bit I had went straight to hospital bills. Now, I just keep moving forward. Barron swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life knowing that no matter what happened, there was always a safety net beneath him. But for Mr. Lawson, there had never been one at all. For the first time, Barron felt ashamed of how little he had understood about people like him. I never thought about it that way, Barron admitted, his voice quieter now. Mr. Lawson gave him a kind but tired smile. Most people don't, he said simply. Not their fault. You don't see things unless life forces you to. Barron nodded, staring at the floor. He had come out here just to stretch his legs, maybe make small talk. Instead, he had walked into something much bigger. Something that made him question things he had never questioned before. And for the first time in his life, he realized he wanted to do something about it. Barron walked down the long hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty school. The walls, the floors, the lockers, everything looked the same, but something felt different. He wasn't thinking about his project anymore. That assignment, the one he had been stressing over just an hour ago, now seemed completely meaningless. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Mr. Lawson. The quiet way he had spoken about his struggles, the acceptance in his voice, as if he had long stopped expecting anything different. Barron had never thought about what it meant to work your whole life just to survive. He had always assumed that at some point, people retired, took a step back, and enjoyed their later years. But that wasn't the reality for everyone. It made him uncomfortable. Not because he didn't want to know, but because now that he did, he couldn't ignore it. As he stepped outside, the late afternoon sun felt warmer than usual, though it didn't reach the cold weight settling in his chest. He had everything: comfort, security, a future lined up with endless opportunities. And yet, a man like Mr. Lawson, who had spent decades keeping the school running, had nothing to fall back on. What if he had never spoken to him? What if he had just walked past, like he had every other day? Would he have gone through life never realizing that people like Mr. Lawson existed all around him? That thought unsettled him more than anything. As he got into the car, the driver asked, "Heading home, sir?" Barron barely heard him. He nodded, staring out the window as they pulled away from the school. For the first time in his life, Barron felt guilty about how easy everything had been for him. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had never questioned the world beyond his own. The roads blurred past, but his thoughts were locked on one thing: how could he help Mr. Lawson? Throwing money at the problem felt wrong. He knew if he simply handed over a check, Mr. Lawson would probably refuse it. He wasn't someone looking for charity. He was a man who took pride in standing on his own feet, no matter how much it cost him. Barron sighed, running a hand through his hair. He needed to find a way to help that wouldn't make Mr. Lawson feel like he was receiving a favor. It had to be something meaningful, something that actually made a difference in his life without taking away his dignity. Then it hit him. His father had connections. Not just in business but in organizations that helped people in difficult situations. Barron had never paid much attention to those things before, but now, it felt like a door had just opened in front of him. He could use those resources, not to hand Mr. Lawson money, but to create an opportunity for him. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew where to start. For the first time since that conversation, he felt a sense of direction. He didn't just want to help. He needed to. Barron sat in his room, staring at his phone. The weight of his conversation with Mr. Lawson hadn't left him. It had only grown heavier. He had spent the whole evening thinking about it, turning the situation over in his mind. He knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just walk away from this. But how could he help without making Mr. Lawson feel like a charity case? Barron leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew his father had powerful connections, people who could solve problems with a single phone call. But this wasn't about pulling strings to make something disappear. Mr. Lawson deserved more than that. He needed a real solution. He scrolled through his contacts and paused on a familiar name. Mr. Reynolds, a close associate of his father, someone deeply involved in community welfare projects. He had heard his father mention him before, talking about how he worked with organizations that helped struggling families, retired workers, and even veterans. Barron tapped the call button. The line rang twice before a calm voice answered. "Barron? Everything all right?" "Yeah," Barron said quickly, then hesitated. He didn't even know how to start this conversation. "I actually need your help with something." There was a pause. "Go on." Barron took a deep breath. "There's a janitor at my school, Mr. Lawson. He's been working there for over 40 years. He's 75 now, but he can't retire because of medical bills and family responsibilities. I want to help him, but I don't want it to feel like charity. I want him to have the chance to retire with dignity." Mr. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "That's a big thing to take on, Barron." "I know," Barron admitted, "but it's the right thing to do." There was a hum of approval in the man's voice. "All right. We have some programs for people in his situation. If we can clear his medical debts and set up financial stability, he could retire without feeling like he's taking a handout." "That's exactly what I need," Barron said, his voice firm. Mr. Reynolds nodded on the other end. "I'll make a few calls. We'll need some legal help to ensure everything is secure, and I'll speak to a few people who specialize in retirement planning. Give me a little time." Barron exhaled, feeling a small weight lift. "Thank you. This is a good thing you're doing," Mr. Reynolds said before the call ended. Barron set his phone down, his mind racing. Step 1 was in motion. Now, he had to make sure everything happened the right way. The next morning, Barron arrived at school with a quiet sense of purpose. He hadn't told anyone what he was doing. Not his classmates, not his teachers, not even his father. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted to see this through. By lunchtime, his phone buzzed. Mr. Reynolds had set things in motion. A team was already working on covering Mr. Lawson's medical expenses. Lawyers were looking into securing a retirement fund that would allow him to live comfortably. It was happening faster than Barron had expected, but he didn't mind. Later that afternoon, he found himself watching Mr. Lawson again. The janitor moved through the hall with the same quiet determination, sweeping away the dust that students left behind. He had no idea that his life was about to change. Barron felt nervous. He had done everything he could to make sure this was done the right way. But what if Mr. Lawson didn't accept it? What if he refused the help, thinking it was pity? That evening, Mr. Reynolds called again. "Everything is ready." Barron sat up. "That fast?" "We pulled some strings, but most of it came from the right places," Reynolds explained. "Medical debts, gone. Retirement plan, set up. We even arranged a financial advisor for him so he'll never have to worry about anything again." Barron let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "He won't know it was from me, right?" "No. As far as he'll know, the school arranged it through a long overdue retirement program. It'll look official, nothing out of place." Barron nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. "Then I guess it's time." Tomorrow, Mr. Lawson's life would change. The next morning, Barron walked through the school hallways, waiting for the moment everything would change. Mr. Lawson was doing what he always did, sweeping, cleaning, making sure the school looked perfect before the day began. But today was different. By lunchtime, Whispers had already started circulating. A few students had noticed that Mr. Lawson had a long conversation with the principal that morning. Others overheard some teachers talking in hushed voices. "Did you hear?" one student muttered. "I think Mr. Lawson is retiring," another replied. "Wait, what? Since when?" By the time classes ended, the news had spread like wildfire. Barron listened from the sidelines, pretending not to pay attention as different versions of the story passed through the crowd. Some thought it was a school initiative. Others believed the janitor had finally decided it was time. No one knew the real reason, and that was exactly how Barron wanted it. In the teacher's lounge, staff members gathered, surprised by the sudden announcement. "He never mentioned retirement before," one teacher said, shaking his head. "I thought he'd be here forever." Another teacher sighed. "Maybe we should have asked if he needed help sooner." Something had shifted. People were starting to see Mr. Lawson in a different way, not just as a janitor, but as a person who had spent decades quietly holding the school together. For the first time, students and teachers alike were talking about him with the respect he had always deserved. Barron sat outside on the steps, watching as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky. He had done what he set out to do. Mr. Lawson wouldn't have to work himself to exhaustion anymore. He could finally rest without worrying about how he would survive. No one knew the part Barron played in it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in his life, Barron understood how much of a difference one person could make. He had always believed that change required big, public gestures. But now he realized that real change often happened quietly, behind the scenes. He glanced back at the school building, seeing it differently than he had before. It wasn't just a place where students studied and teachers taught. It was full of people like Mr. Lawson, people who worked in the background, unnoticed, yet essential. Barron had walked these halls for years without ever acknowledging that. Now, he couldn't unsee it. As he stood up, ready to leave for the day, he heard someone call his name. He turned to see a group of students gathered near the lockers, still discussing Mr. Lawson's retirement. "I never really thought about how hard he worked," one of them said. "Yeah," another agreed. "We just walked past him every day like he was part of the building." Barron didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because the change had already begun. The school halls were quieter than usual. The usual morning rush of students filling their lockers, teachers hurrying to their classrooms, and the distant ringing of phones in the office all seemed a little softer today. Something was different. Barron walked toward the janitor's closet, his steps slow, almost hesitant. He knew this was the last time he would see Mr. Lawson in this space, the last time he would find him pushing a mop bucket or straightening the supply shelves like he had done for decades. The door was slightly open. Inside, Mr. Lawson stood with his back to him, folding up a faded cleaning rag, his movements unhurried, as if he were taking in every detail of this place one last time. Barron knocked lightly on the doorframe. Mr. Lawson turned, his tired eyes settling on Barron with a look that was both surprised and expectant. He gave a small nod. "Didn't think I'd see you this morning." Barron stepped inside, leaning against the door. "I wanted to say goodbye." The older man gave him a knowing smile. "Ah, so you heard." Barron nodded. "Yeah, they said you're officially retiring." Mr. Lawson chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess it was bound to happen someday." He glanced around the small closet, his eyes landing on the neatly arranged shelves filled with cleaning supplies. 40 years in this place. It's hard to believe I won't be walking these halls anymore." Barron swallowed, trying to find the right words. He had planned what he wanted to say, but now, standing here, everything felt heavier. "You deserve to rest," he finally said. Mr. Lawson studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "Maybe I do." There was silence between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. After a moment, Mr. Lawson sighed, looking at Barron with something that almost resembled gratitude. "I don't know how it happened, but I know someone pulled some strings to make this work." His eyes held a quiet understanding. "I just want you to know, son, I wasn't looking for help. I was just doing what had to be done." Barron met his gaze, unsure how to respond. He had done everything to make sure Mr. Lawson never felt like a charity case, but deep down, the old man knew. He wasn't angry about it. If anything, there was a quiet appreciation in his expression. "You did more than just work here," Barron said finally. "You made this place better. And people are finally seeing that." Mr. Lawson let out a breath, nodding slowly. "That's all a man can hope for, isn't it?" Barron didn't trust himself to say anything more, so he just extended his hand. Mr. Lawson looked at it for a second before shaking it firmly, his grip strong despite the years of labor that had worn him down. "Take care, Barron," he said. "You too, Mr. Lawson." Barron turned to leave, but as he stepped out into the hallway, something inside him felt different. As he walked through the school, the air around him felt heavier, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him realize something had changed. He had spent years walking these halls, passing by faces without thinking twice. But today, for the first time, he truly saw them. The security guards standing by the main doors, the cafeteria workers preparing lunch, the office staff sorting through papers, people who had always been there, yet had never been acknowledged the way they deserved. Barron had grown up in a world where success was measured by power, influence, and wealth. But today, he understood something else. Real impact wasn't always about changing the world in big, flashy ways. Sometimes, it was about the quiet things, about seeing people, really seeing them, and doing something that made a difference. He had done that for Mr. Lawson. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Barron walked through the school one last time before heading home. Everything looked the same, the polished floors, the rows of lockers, the familiar classrooms, but something about it felt different. Or maybe, he was the one who had changed. For years, he had passed by people like Mr. Lawson without a second thought. Not because he didn't care, but because he never thought to look. It wasn't until that one conversation that he realized how much life was happening around him. Lives filled with struggle, resilience, and quiet strength. Mr. Lawson's story wasn't unique. There were people everywhere just like him, working tirelessly, carrying burdens no one saw, doing jobs that others took for granted. Janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, clerks at grocery stores. Faces that faded into the background until someone finally stopped to notice. Barron had grown up believing that making a difference meant doing something big. But now he understood that real impact wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it was as simple as paying attention, as acknowledging someone's existence, as showing them they mattered. He had helped Mr. Lawson step away from years of exhaustion, but in the process, he had learned something just as valuable. People don't always ask for help, but that doesn't mean they don't need it. As he stepped outside, the warm breeze brushed against his face. The day felt lighter, yet full of meaning. He thought about how easy it would have been to walk away, to pretend he hadn't heard Mr. Lawson's story, to move on with his life unchanged. But ignoring it wouldn't have made it any less real. The truth was, everyone had a choice, to see or to look away. And Barron hoped that more people would choose to see. Because the world didn't change in an instant. It changed in small moments, in quiet decisions, in the way people treated each other when no one was watching. Maybe the next time someone passed by a janitor, they would stop and say hello. Maybe they would take a second to ask how they were doing, to see them as more than just the job they did. Maybe, just maybe, it would make all the difference. Because sometimes, kindness wasn't about fixing everything. It was simply about making sure no one felt invisible.